Today on CityCast Boise, our state is struggling with nursing shortages, but Idaho State Police are fighting against that trend by working to have 250 sexual assault nurse examiners, or SANE nurses, trained by the end of the year. Idaho Reports journalist Ruth Brown is joining me to break down what a SANE nurse does and why they are so desperately needed in Idaho. Content warning, this episode discusses topics that may be upsetting. It's Monday, September 23rd. I'm Lindsay Van Allen, and this is what Boise's talking about. Hey, Ruth, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Just before we can even jump into this story, I really wanted to ask for a little clarification about what is a sexual assault nurse examiner and how do they differ from other nurses?
Sure. A sexual assault nurse examiner is trained in collecting forensic evidence. So this would be after a sexual assault has occurred. A victim goes into either a hospital or sometimes it's a victim center and says they've been assaulted. The nurse has additional training that your average RN wouldn't have in both the collection of the evidence, but they also get a lot of training in trauma-informed care. Maybe your average ER nurse is working very quickly. She's trying to get a lot of patients in a short amount of time, trying to help as many people as possible. A SANE nurse is going to approach a victim slowly. She's going to talk to them at their pace and not dive into it quite as quickly as, maybe an average ER nurse would do that. And that's not a dig on ER nurses. They're just woefully understaffed.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's just a fast-paced, you gotta get things moving. It's an emergency space. So with this trauma-informed care, what are some examples of what that would look like for a victim, or would be different than just your standard, like, here's the nurse, start the IV, start the care?
Sure. So I think slowly, that was something that nurse coordinator that I talked to spoke to me a lot about the pace, just slowly approaching and not diving into it. Saying, I'm sorry this happened to you, Jane Doe. Can you tell me a little bit about what happened? So they'll gather information about what exactly happened, and that will also give them information about where there may be forensic evidence to look for based on, what sort of act occurred. But I also think just listening to the victim and letting them go at their pace, there is a whole lot of evidence that your neurobiology changes after you experience trauma, and there's different ways to talk to the victim. The nurse coordinator I interviewed, she gave me an example. She had one patient who was so shut down that he had sort of balled himself up in the corner of the room, and it was a small exam room, and she said it took 40 minutes just to get across the exam room. So that's slowly talking to him and communicating with him about what was happening. No fast movements, no reaching out and touching, slowly communicating with them and building that trust. And an average rape kit or sexual assault kit exam takes about 4 to 6 hours. And
wow.
That's another reason that the average nurse simply doesn't have enough time. She has other patients to attend to. So the SANE nurse comes in and handles that. They spend a lot of time with the victim, both in the exam, but a lot of it is just talking to them and getting them to open up and be comfortable enough to explain what has happened to them.
And that sounds like a very important but very specialized role that they need to play in those situations. Is this like a full-time job? So like, how somebody's like a NICU nurse, that's their job, or a telemetry nurse. Are SANE nurses, that's their entire job?
Rarely. Most of them are part-time. So they'll have a full-time job doing peds or OB or whatever they do. And then depending on where they work, for example, in Eastern Idaho, there's a domestic violence center that employs 8 nurses who are trained SANE nurses, and they are on call. They're on a rotating shift. For if an assault occurs, the ER will call and ask, which nurse is on call and try to get that access. By the end of the year, ISP will have 250 SANE trained nurses, which is a dramatic increase from where we were 4 years ago. There is still a shortage. There are still, I believe, 18 counties where you would not be able to get a sane trained nurse. So that in that case, you would either just not get an exam, or you would have to drive to another county, a neighboring county, which obviously is not ideal after someone has experienced that level of trauma.
So it sounds like there are potentially some big gaps in the state where some areas and healthcare facilities have access to a sane trained nurse and some don't. They have to borrow one or have one travel. And how does that impact care for the community and, the other nurses in that facility who then have to kind of pick up that job without that specialized training?
It shouldn't be surprising if you know anything about the healthcare system in Idaho. There are healthcare shortages. There are nursing shortages, physician shortages in Idaho, particularly in rural Idaho. I will say some of the counties that don't have these facilities, I wouldn't call them particularly rural. For example, Elmore, Owyhee County, they're relatively populated counties. I mean, others like Clark County and, Custer, Butte, you would expect to not be able to have that service just because it is such a rural county and Idaho is such a rural state that I think folks that live there are used to having to drive for those services, for any service, I mean, whether they need to go to the dentist or, have an annual physical. I think there's just a healthcare shortage in general. But I think particularly with sexual assault victims, it's unfortunate because your body is the evidence.
Yeah.
And I think it's very understandable that after a sexual assault, the first thing you want to do is shower or, go home. You don't want people like poking at you. It's very understandable. So it does create some barriers and some discrepancies based on where you live, which is unfortunate. But I will say Idaho State Police has made a dramatic effort over the last 4 years to train nurses. 4 years ago, there were only 3 sane trained nurses. So we've gone from 3 to 250. There were 17 locations where you could walk in to, say, an ER, and the physician or the nurse on duty would help you. But they would just be following the instructions on the rape kit box. They wouldn't necessarily be specifically trained in forensic evidence collection, nor would they be trained in just being trauma informed in the way they approach the person who's been assaulted. And so we have made serious strides, I think, in training more folks and making it more available. But I think just because Idaho is such a gigantic state, and we have so many rural areas, that it's an uphill battle to get every county.
Well, and having that trauma-informed care, I don't think people always realize what goes into these rape kits. It's not just, there's swabs, there's pictures, it can feel pretty invasive after you've just had something really traumatic happen. And then if you have to travel to a facility you're not familiar with in a town that is, it could be up to hours away from you, that does seem like a pretty big barrier to actually getting that treatment.
It's discouraging because I think, as we know, many, many rapes go unreported. The rate at which sexual assault is reported is dramatically lower than what we know from what advocates have. They talk to victims who never actually talked to police or reported to police. So we know that it is dramatically underreported, excuse me. And so creating any kind of barrier to allowing a person to report only exacerbates the problem.
Yeah. How many facilities are there for people who might have this happen in Ada County?
So in Ada County, they usually send them to the Ada County Victim Center. They're not 24 hours a day. So you could go to the hospital and they could try and get a sane nurse, or they would make an appointment for when the Ada County Victim Center is open. And the staff there are trained in trauma-informed care. So it's just easier. It's just easier, I guess. It's not impossible in these other counties. It's just more of a headache. And the rate of rape being so underreported, I think everyone agrees, including law enforcement and medical staff, that you want to make it as easy as possible to get care.
as you mentioned, we are having some pretty major healthcare shortages in this state for a variety of reasons. Has that also been a problem for keeping or maintaining our supply? I don't want to say supply, our amount of sane nurses in Idaho?
I think some of the medical shortages in Idaho, you can point to, say, things like salary. Other states pay nurses more. Mm-hmm. When it comes to sane nurses, I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that it's a very difficult job. The sane nurses I interviewed, explained these nurses, you're with the victim for maybe 6 hours, and she or he is telling you about a chronic trauma of the worst of the worst. I hear a quote from one of the nurses I interviewed. She said, quote, "When you are exposed to someone else's trauma over and over and you hear the horrific things that another human being is willing to do to someone, you really have to know how to take care of yourself," end quote. And so the point she's making is that even if we had a state with a robust nursing capacity, it's not something that everybody would want to do. It's not something that everybody should do. I think you need to know yourself and know what your ability is. It's a different kind of trauma, and that you are enduring, a vicarious trauma that you're enduring by talking to these victims. It's an important job. I think it's a commendable job. So I think the statewide nursing shortage that we have is not necessarily comparable to the sane nursing. I think sane nursing has other complications, other demands, I suppose.
And you recently reported about the new Idaho parental medical consent law. How is that affecting sane nurses' ability to perform exams and collect this really important evidence?
So just backing up a little bit, Senate Bill 1329 passed during the 2024 legislative session, and its intent was to prohibit medical procedures on minors without parental consent and also allow parents to have access to their children's medical records. Whereas right now, I think it's about age 14, children need to give their parents permission to have access to their medical records for some types of medical procedures. Mm-hmm. And that's standard nationwide. So this changed the law. So that was the intent of the bill. Unintentionally, the bill prohibits minors from getting a sexual assault exam without parental consent. And this becomes problematic if the perpetrator of the child's sexual assault is the parent or is a family member. And it's dark to think about. We all hope that, a parent would bring their child in for an exam if they learned of the abuse, but I think that is not what all sane nurses have experienced. Mm. For example, say the perpetrator is the mother's boyfriend or it's stepdad or, a close family friend. The nurses that I spoke with said they have experienced, mom not taking the child's side or just not believing the child, saying she's been a liar since she's 8 years old. We shouldn't believe her. And that's a dark reality, but I think it's also important that we remember not all parents have their child's best interest in mind. So this was not the intent of the bill. That's clear. I've spoken with the bill's sponsor, but it is an unintentional consequence,
and a pretty dramatic one. That even if it wasn't the intent, it has a strong outcome and potentially really strong repercussions for these children. What was, prior to this law going into effect, what criteria had to be met before a sane nurse could perform an exam on a child?
Sure. So prior to the law passing, there was informed consent. So I believe the age was 14. Yeah. A person age 14 or older could give informed consent to a nurse to have an exam. And I want to be clear, even though the law is in effect, it's not like the state could do nothing. Of course they could. If a nurse suspects abuse, she could report it to police. Police would report it to CPS. There would be an investigation. So it's not like it's impossible. Mm-hmm. If the prosecutor was involved, they could get a warrant. The issue is that, again, when it comes to rape and sexual assault, your physical body is the evidence. And so the forensic lab will accept evidence up to 5 days after a sexual assault has occurred. So the example I was given by a nurse is, say you're Jane Doe, you're Jane Doe that's under 18, comes in and reports it 2 days after an assault has occurred. The clock is ticking to collect that forensic evidence. And if the parent does not consent to collecting the evidence, there would need to be CPS involved and a warrant would need to be issued. And those things take time. So I think that's the concern, is there is a lack of the immediate access to being able to give that evidence. And when I think of child abuse cases, oftentimes this abuse has occurred more than once. And so if your Jane Doe has gotten up the courage to go in and then she can't get the rape kit, it's discouraging to think of how heartbroken she would be. Or the nurse that I talked to said, she's always worried about the child's mental health, because now if she goes home and CPS is involved, what is mom going to say? Is mom going to be mad? Are parents going to be upset? Because now you've gotten health and welfare is coming around the house, and it's just complicated. These cases are just so complicated.
Absolutely. It sounds like, unfortunately, it has just created potentially more barriers, more stress, potentially more of a demoralizing situation for these victims.
Yeah, that's accurate, I think.
Ruth, I wanted to give the audience some usable information just in case the unthinkable ever happens. Where can people in Ada County go if they need help or an exam?
Sure. There are 2 places that I would refer them to: the Ada County Victims Center, or to FACES, which is a nonprofit. The Women's and Children's Alliance could also refer you to they don't do rape kits at Women's and Children's Alliance, but they could definitely offer you resources.
And then, just because we have reach throughout the Treasure Valley, where could people in Canyon County go?
Sure. So Nampa has a victim center as well. And I believe they might actually be 24/7. And they have a SAFE program. That's the Nampa Family Justice Center.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you. This is a really heavy topic and can be really complicated. So thank you for taking the time to break it down and get us some information about it.
Thanks for having me.
That's all for today here on CityCast Boise. If you enjoyed the show, you should subscribe to our Hey Boise newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with another great local story. Catch you then.